webinar, the SDL WorldServer Quarterly Showcase. My name is Kate Bradshaw and I will be your host. Your speaker today is Ray Hopley, Product Management Director for SDL WorldServer. We expect today's webinar will last about 35 to 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. In this quarterly showcase, we'll discuss GDPR, providing best practice insight into GDPR compliance and SDL WorldServer. I will now pass you over to Ray to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Kate, and welcome everybody to today's session. This is the quarterly product showcase webinar. Normally this is a forum for me to show off various features within the application, but today we thought we'd talk about GDPR. It's obviously high in everybody's mind currently. The clock is ticking. 25th of May, this new piece of legislation comes into effect. And obviously I've had lots of questions from the install base, and I thought today would be a great opportunity to explain to you a little bit how you, as a WorldServer customer, can be GDPR compliant when using SDL WorldServer. And talk a little bit about some definitions of some GDPR concepts. Warning, there's some legalese here, but I think it's necessary in order to set the frame and the context for the details that I'm going to go into. Then I'm going to talk specifically about the data flows within SDL WorldServer and application. There are two key concepts in GDPR, data processor and data controller, and you'll find out what those mean if you don't know. And then I'll talk at the end about how we can enable compliance and allow you to be compliant with GDPR using SDL WorldServer. So, some caveats in the beginning. I'm not a lawyer. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the legal definitions here, but I'm not a lawyer. But this has, content obviously has been put together together with our data privacy officer. He's obviously been very busy this year putting together not only the product-based GDPR compliance requirements, but also for SDLP. We ourselves, obviously, our own processes and business applications need to be GDPR compliant as well, but that's separate from how you, as a customer using our applications, can be GDPR compliant yourselves. Of course, it doesn't cover everything related to GDPR. It's very specifically about the compliance and the requirements for delivering compliance within the translation workflow as governed by SDL WorldServer. So just a couple of notes of caution in there. So warning, a lot of text about to come on the next slide. It's bad form PowerPoint-wise, but it's important to get these legal definitions correct. GDPR is actually a regulation which is replacing a directive. Those are technical concepts that are part of the European Union. As it says in the second bullet there, a regulation is a binding act, and it's harmonized across the entire EU member states. The previous directive was slightly looser. It allowed for individual countries, member countries, to determine how they would achieve the goal as expressed in that directive. But this GDPR is a regulation. It's a little, and you'll see on the next slide, one of the key differences here is the penalties for non-compliance, which can be significant. So 4% of annual global revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is the greater. This is the maximum. There are obviously tiers of compliance depending on, or tiers of penalties rather, for non-compliance, depending on what you're non-compliant with and the significance of the breach and the risk to individual data subjects. The other big difference is that this applies now outside the bounds of the European Union. So a US-based company that deals with the personal data of EU citizens resident in the EU is also bound by GDPR compliance requirements. So that's another big change. So it's broadened the scope hugely. And also the conditions for consent have been strengthened so that there must now be a minimal of legalese, the terms and conditions kind of statements that we're all familiar with that we don't read and click through. Those, the GDPR now requires them to be written in a very clear and concise manner, expressing exactly what you're consenting to with the storage of your private data. And the removal of your consent needs to be as easy as giving the consent. So this is putting some of the power back into the citizens' hands versus the companies that are storing your data. So just to clarify the difference between a regulation and a directive and what GDPR means in terms of compliance and non-compliance. It confers some additional rights, so these were largely also embodied in the previous directive, but they've been formalized and extended somewhat. The rights of access, rectification, erasure, this is one of the key ones, delete my data. So I've explained in parentheses what these things mean. You can object to the processing of your personal data. You can limit that so that only certain parts of your personal data can be processed by the data processor. Data portability means give me a copy of the data that you hold on me in a machine-readable and processable format. So you can't just output something that's all gobbledygook from a computer system. It has to be machine-readable. And then there's the important one is the right to be notified of data breaches. So tell me when my data has been compromised. And there are certain limitations here. So the data breach, the supervisory authority must be informed within 72 hours of such a breach occurring, or your awareness of such a breach occurring. All of the other requests that can come from a citizen, a data subject as they're called, you have 30 days to comply with that request. And the last bullet there actually is something that should not be overlooked. If somebody asks a data processor to delete their data, it's perfectly legitimate in many circumstances to say no, that's not possible. I'll give you a kind of a trivial example. I work for SDL, of course, and SDL holds quite a bit of personal data about me. Now, according to GDPR, I can ask HR to delete my personnel records, and quite legitimately they will come back and say, well, we can't do that because you're still an employee. So the terms of the employment contract I have limit some of the exercise of the rights that GDPR gives me. And there are quite a number of legal bases for saying no. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I just know that there are quite a number of circumstances. If you need to know what they are and how they pertain to your own business, then obviously you need to seek legal advice through your own data security officers. But just to be clear, it's not, it doesn't mean that it's impossible to store personal data, and if somebody requests you, you mustn't do that. There are many legitimate reasons why you may not be able to do that because of other laws that are in place. I just wanted to clarify a little bit of the position there around GDPR and what it is. There are many myths floating around about what it means. Again, I don't claim exhaustive knowledge, but I'm trying to give you a little bit of a framework and a context to understand what it does mean, and certainly what it means in terms of processing with WorldServer, where, for example, you might have a contract with a translation supplier. So let's move on and figure out how this all applies to WorldServer. So some more definitions. There are 3 points here. A data subject, that's an individual. Data controller, that is the person or the entity that's responsible for deciding how and why personal data will be processed. Why is also important. When you apply for consent or you request consent from users, there has to be a legal basis for you wanting to store that and process that personal data, and there are a number of these spelled out in the legislation. So again, I would refer you to that through your data privacy officers. And then a data processor, so this is an entity, a thing, an application, a company that processes data on behalf of data controllers, and they're responsible for that within the framework of what GDPR requires. In WorldServer speak, a data subject is any user that's defined within the application. As you know, there is a user management component there. Each user has a user type that governs their permissions. They have workflow roles. They have a number of properties associated with them, locales and work groups, possibly clients and vendors and other things. But a user account represents a data subject. The data controller are the people responsible for submitting content. So that's you sometimes as the system owner. It changes a little bit if we're talking about the LSP model, because then there is a role switch between data processor and data controller, but we'll not get it bogged down into the complexities of that right now. But a data controller submits content for translation, and a data processor is WorldServer itself, essentially. It's the application that stores the personal information that we configure in the system. And really, it's about workflow execution, so user assignments, what users can do. This is where we utilize what is personally identifiable information, and also translation memories, and I'll come on and talk about that a little bit at the end, as there are two aspects to that. There's the data controller and a data processor, both of which write potentially personally identifiable information into your TM. So here's a list of what PII, personally identifiable information, is. Some standard stuff on the left here: first and last name, title, date of birth, address, some other kind of personal information. Then there's what's called a special category of personally identifiable information, which is deemed to be more sensitive. Therefore, the kind of impact of a loss or a breach of this data is deemed to be more significant. And there's a whole bunch of other things here: payment card details, driver license, things that you could potentially, as a malicious person could abuse and exploit on somebody else's behalf. And if we think about the broadness that GDPR covers, right, it's not only related to WorldServer and application, but covers absolutely every aspect of businesses that store information related to individuals. So, for example, if I think about my Amazon account, I have at least half a dozen addresses in there, my siblings, my children, I've got 3 credit cards in there. There's a lot of sensitive information. In the WorldServer context, we don't store anything like that kind of detail. We don't need to. We only really need some very limited information. So it's the application of GDPR, while it is universal within the bounds of the EU citizens' rights, for specific applications, it applies much less, or the sensitivity of the information that we store is much lesser than other kinds of operations that deal with individuals and their accounts and their personal information. So as a data processor, as I mentioned, we only really store a very minimal amount of personally identifiable information. And the data that we do store is deemed to be of very low risk. So that means, should there be a breach, if your user account details in WorldServer are compromised somehow, that the release of that information will expose you to a very limited risk that you somehow that personal information can be misused. As a data controller, which is, again, just to remind ourselves, is about the content that gets passed through the system for translation, that's a little bit different, because that will end up in the translation memory. And again, I'll come and explain a little bit more in detail about that. But so there are two aspects here. When WorldServer acts as a data processor, which is kind of the default model, content is coming in, the users that are defined in that system have some personally identifiable information in there for their accounts, but the content could potentially contain all kinds of other personal identifiable information. Now, in the WorldServer context, again, we are an enterprise translation management tool. We typically manage the localization and translation of enterprise content. A lot of that relates to, user manuals, for example, technical documentation, administrator guides, whatever, in-car audio, handset guides, those kind of things, right? Product-related information. It's very unlikely that typical enterprise content will contain any personally identifiable information. You could, for example, translate your resume or a birth certificate, and you could indeed manage that through WorldServer. Typically, that isn't a use case that we'd ever come across in the real world, but it's certainly possible, where the data controlling aspect comes in. So here's an example of my WorldServer user account, one of the instances, many instances that I'm configured in, and I've highlighted in red what is the personally identifiable information. Again, it's absolutely minimal. It's my username. I've put my first and last name in there, and typically, although it's only optional, I put in an email address. Everything else that's associated with a user account in WorldServer is not personally identifiable information. It relates to the processing of the application, the work allocation criteria. So if I have the German locale selected, I'm available for translating for German projects, but not for French, for example. But those are all governing the routing of work translation packages through the system. None of it is personally identifiable. So again, very, very minimal set of data points that we actually require in WorldServer that are considered PII under GDPR. Okay. So here is a kind of high-level data flow diagram. So this is one of the things that we've had to do in order to provide the material for this presentation, but also further than that, to assist you in your own GDPR compliance, is map the data flow through the system. Where are the exit points for personally identifiable information? And potentially, you can see here there are a number of places where we could write that information to. So it could potentially end up in a report. If you have a report about the number of users in the system and when they last logged in, that could contain information. We have also TMs and terminology, potentially, log files, work packages, and also the WorldServer database, which is really the heart of the application where things are actually stored in a more permanent manner. And I've done some mapping as well, so a little bit of technical detail here, you don't need to worry about that, but I've highlighted, I think, the 8 individual fields within the active tasks table. So this is really about user assignments and claimants and who's doing the translation work, essentially. And this is the database schema for those active tasks, how they link together, and where those 8 data points are. This is very important when it comes to complying with a request for access or a request for erasure or any of the other kind of requests. Give me access to the data. Remember, I think there are 8 rights altogether that are conferred upon the EU citizens now, and so you need to know exactly which fields in which database tables that PII is stored, and this gives you one side of it. On the other side, we also have the archive reporting tables. So again, it's a very similar picture actually. The structure is slightly different, but it's essentially the same pieces of information related to users. Again, it's very minimal, and it's usually the username or the user ID. But indeed, this counts as personally identifiable information. And so here we have highlighted those particular fields that will store that data. Usernames on translation units in TM. So again, in addition to the task and work assignment tables in the database, we also, when you are modifying translation text, translated text, either at translation, review, or maybe you have a TMX file that you're importing that has some usernames associated with the segment, we will copy those here. There's already a very nice feature for searching in translation memories. If you click on the advanced options, you get the ability to specify some additional parameters, and one of them is to search by who created or who modified those translation units. And here you can see I've identified all the TUs that have been created by our colleague Larry Bregman. So with this information, I can see exactly where in the application we are storing that personally identifiable information, which is his first and last name in this case. And then, subject to whatever the request might be, I can either export that and provide it. That's the right of portability of data. I can delete it if I want to do that. I'm going to talk about the recommendations that we have, which is more along the lines of anonymizing the data in order that we can retain those segments in the translation memory. But the key takeaway from this slide is that as well as the tasks and the project-related assignment and user information, we also store the created by and modified by username for segments that are saved into the TM. So WorldServer as a data controller, now this is about content submission, so there's a slightly different path here, but it's essentially a similar diagram that we have the database, we have the studio packages. They could potentially contain a username for whoever is assigned to that particular step in the workflow when they're exporting packages. And again, we have translation memory. So this screen is really showing now, as well as the modified by user. You see I'm highlighting my own name there in the yellow box because I made a modification to the content of this particular translation unit. But The translation unit itself contains my name. It could be anybody's name. It could be Kate's name. It could be some other piece of information that is personally identifiable. The point being, this has come from a piece of content. This is not generated through the operation of WorldServer itself as an application like the modified by name. That's just capturing for audit purposes who made this change and when. But this piece of content came from a document, which I'm actually completing the writing of this week, and I am the author of that document. So there are two different aspects here. As a data processor, we require user accounts because we assign people work. We need to know their email address because we send them an email notification telling them that there is work for them to do. And we record also in the TM the segments that they may have created or modified along the way. Then there is WorldServer as a data controller, which is accepting content that you are responsible for in terms of whether it contains personally identifiable information. The system at this point has no means of identifying that my name appeared in that document, and will just quite happily put it into the translation memory as the normal function of the application says it should do. So really the responsibility of the data controller, which is you as the system owner, is for controlling the content and what's in that content that come through. As I mentioned, typical enterprise use cases don't contain anything related to individuals. It's more about products or marketing or some other aspects. So it would be an unusual use case, but indeed the responsibility is with the data controller, the system owner, for governing that. Okay. Moving on to compliance, how you can be compliant. A couple of key concepts as well, anonymization and pseudonymization, which is kind of an ugly word, but it's an important concept. And that table gives you an idea of the difference between the two. Anonymized is simply we blank it out. It's irretrievable. You'll never know again whoever the person was who did that particular operation. So it's kind of a one-way street. It guarantees you that there is no personally identifiable information in the database or in any other locations where we might have written it to, but it is obviously problematic in many respects when it comes to things like audit trail. We do have, for example, a number of customers where there is a requirement to retain data for X amount of years because they are manufacturing medical devices and they need, for their own legal audit requirements, to retain the data of who translated what and when. Right, so that's another one of those examples where you might legitimately say no to the data erasure. Right, so anonymization is kind of a brute force, just get rid of it kind of approach. Pseudonymization is slightly different. It's about replacing the personally identifiable information with a token, actually something. But as you can see from that table, when we have Les, it's replaced with MTV, and Marco is in there twice as well, and Clyde. And you can quickly derive a pattern, right? There must be some mapping that says Clyde is QOERD, right? And it requires the key to be maintained, right? Which, marginally increases the risk, but as a data processor, let's see, the user account details, we can anonymize the personal identifiable information, so you can blank it out. But as a data controller, what you can become responsible for then is the pseudonymization upfront of any content that you pass through the system. So if you think that there is likely to be any personally identifiable information in a piece of content that you're submitting for translation, the best practice says that you should pseudonymize that and maintain the key outside of the system. There is a very nice paragraph from the actual GDPR documentation, which I'll share with you in a moment. If you're given a request to delete, right, the anonymization is currently a manual process. So there's some scripted, semi-automated solution planned for this currently. We don't have those scripts available, but we, as you've seen from the detail I've been providing, we know where that data is and we can provide the manual instructions for you to go and anonymize that data. There's also in the plan, in the roadmap for this year, the development of an endpoint that will allow us to modify or created and modified by users for the system attributes. Again, the idea of anonymizing might conflict with other audit requirements that you have, which is where potentially you can say no, or pseudonymization might come in. And then the TM content, as you saw, if you have submitted content for translation and you get a request from a data subject, a user, to delete all of their information, then you also need to do a search in the translation memories in case something has been processed as translatable content and has ended up stored in a translation memory. And you can do that, as I showed you on the previous screen, through the UI already with existing functionality. So here, incentives to pseudonymize. One of the things that we know very well in the translation industry for a number of years about pushing upstream the best practices for creating content for localization is it's very difficult to get people to do this. I'm not talking about pseudonymization now, but just in general, there are any number of white papers on the internet. We've written some ourselves here at SDL about best practices for creating localizable content. It's difficult to get content authors to fully comply with all of those things. And I think it's probably difficult to comply with the request or the requirement to pseudonymize all content that's coming into the system, particularly when you think about the volumes that we process through WorldServer, tens of millions of words a year. But this I took from the GDPR regulation itself. It says, in order to create incentives to apply pseudonymization, and then there's a very long sentence which ends 7 lines later. And to me, that doesn't really create any incentives. If anybody can interpret that in a different way, I'd be very happy to hear it. But indeed, the goal of pseudonymizing source content before it gets passed to the data processor, so the onus being on the data controller to do this pseudonymization action, it requires some incentivization. Even the people who wrote the legislation recognize that. So I imagine that there will be some discussions in the industry and outside of our industry about this requirement, or this best practice, let's call it that, for pseudonymizing source content. It's not always easy to do in an automated way. We have a nice piece of development work ongoing in our R&D center in Cluj, where we're using some of the AI learning technology that we developed for MT to try and identify personally identifiable information. It works quite nicely, but it's not 100% error-proof. It's really requires a human eye to identify in a piece of source text anything that might be personal or information. You saw that the list is not explicitly stated by GDPR legislation itself of what constitutes PII. They talk in a very abstract way about the definition that you can tie a piece of data back to an individual. They also talk about one of the risks of pseudonymization versus anonymization is that if you have a pseudonymized or tokenized representation for a piece of PII, that together with another piece of information, the two things together could allow you to identify an individual. So there are quite a number of, fuzzy edges around some of the definitions of what constitutes PII. And PII is not just one data point. It could be a combination of 3 different things. If you know that I go to Starbucks every morning at 8:30 on my way to work and buy a coffee, and you find the receipt, and then you find the coffee cup, then you can put 2 and 2 together and say that I bought this cup of coffee at 8:30 and it was Ray Hopley. Right? So there are, by combining individual data points, even though in and of themselves they're not identifiable, you can make the identification from combining them. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky related to pseudonymization. So I'm sure there will be more discussion and debate around GDPR and this pseudonymization, anonymization, what constitutes PII as the legislation comes into force and cases come before various jurisdictions. Okay, we're about half-hour mark now and coming to the last slide. So if you want further information, we are publishing an ebook next week on Tuesday, I believe. That will go live on sdl.com to obviously not only advertise our own GDPR compliance as a company, but also to allow you as users of our software to make sure that your businesses can be GDPR compliant when using not only WorldServer, which I've talked about today, but also the broader portfolio of our translation tools. So TMS, Mantra, GroupShare, Trello Studio, Multiterm, even all of the tools are covered off in there, including machine translation. But if you have any other specific questions related to WorldServer, GDPR compliance, what's required, and how we can assist you further, then feel free to reach out to me. I put my personally identifiable email address on the slide so that you can contact me directly. As I mentioned, the current process for complying with the requests that users are entitled now to make related to data access, data portability, and data erasure is a manual process, and we can provide you those steps and obviously those database schemas that I was showing, and the steps that you need to take in order to perform that operation to comply with that request. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Ray. Appreciate you presenting today. While questions come in from the audience, please feel free to start asking those questions and get those coming in. Just wanting to touch on maybe what you've got coming up for the rest of the WorldServer Quarterly Showcase. Obviously, this one very timely with the fact that GDPR is sort of going to be, ready and implemented sort of next week. But what have you got in terms of your plans for future showcases?
Well, the next webinar, as you and I know, because we're planning it currently, is actually a roadmap webinar, which is going to happen on June 7th. And then subsequent to that, there will be 2 more of these product showcases. I'm still finalizing the list. I'm happy to take input from the user base, but we talked in the first one a little bit about translation quality. I do feel that there's more to talk about on that particular topic. Actually, I don't think an hour did it full justice, so potentially we can complete that. There are also other aspects we can talk about, not specifically GDPR, but related to security, website security, things like OWASP and other initiatives guiding security. Again, it's not just GDPR that's topical right now, but also the other aspects related to data security. There's a question here, will there be a session at the upcoming eTug? There isn't currently in the agenda, but I'm more than happy to talk about that, and I can take that away to the other product managers too, as we'll all be there as usual, and maybe we can prepare a kind of joint presentation, or I can lead it and talk about some of the other products as well, because I've been talking about WorldServer, and the ebook that I mentioned covers the product portfolio, but there are indeed some nuances in the detail of how you go about complying with the request. But the principles that I've been explaining today, hopefully clearly, if not, please let me know or ask a question. The principles apply to all of the software. Again, we store minimal amounts of personal data. That data itself considered to be very low risk. If the user account at WorldServer had a username and a credit card number, then obviously things would be a lot more, the risk would be a lot more significant, but it's simply a username and an email address, so it's very, very low risk data anyway.
Cool, great stuff, thank you, Ray. Again, as we're just waiting for some questions to come in, I was wondering if maybe if there's anything else you wanted to touch on, just with regards to the ebook that you mentioned a couple of slides ago, what it actually covers, and we can certainly make sure we send this to all those that attended today as well.
Indeed, it covers very similar material to what I've covered. So the principles about how you can be compliant. It talks about some of the the techniques you can use, the pseudonymization and anonymization, and other things related to the broader supply chain. As I said, it covers the product portfolio, so the picture gets not more complicated, but more extended as you consider the different roles of data controller, data processor across the supply chain. As I'm beginning, if we're thinking about enterprise customers, they are the data controller and the system is the data processor. If that then goes to a language service provider, then if they then further outsource that to a freelance translator, for example. They need the permission from the data controller that they're able to do that. This is often governed by existing contracts and procurement arrangements anyway. So again, there's a lot of, I guess, uncertainty generated with the chatter around GDPR, but indeed many of the existing arrangements that you have can make you, GDPR compliant. For example, the consent rules, right? I've been bombarded. I got one just before this webinar started from Hilton Honors Hotel Points, whatever, requiring me to opt back in because of the changes of GDPR, which simply, is not required. The only requirement to have your users opt back in and refresh the consent that they've already given is if you change the legal basis for which you are requiring to store and process their personal data. If that legal basis has not changed, then you do not need to request or require consent again from existing users. Right? So there's a lot of myths around about GDPR, and a lot of people are erring on the side of overcaution, which, because of the size of the fines, I can understand why that is, but I think the important thing is, and the reason we had this webinar today, is to provide the information that people can make the right decisions based on what the requirement and the legislation actually dictates.
No, very much so, Ray. Thank you for that. We do have another question.
The principle.
So SDL WorldServer integrates well with SDL machine translation solutions. Will this process include machine translated content within a WorldServer workflow?
So again, the content that's being sent for translation, if that contains personally identifiable information, it will potentially be stored in the TM in WorldServer, but very specifically about the integration with MT. So if you send out your content that contains personal information to our machine translation engines, that's all I can speak for, the Language Cloud and Be Global. It's processed, it comes back, it will likely have that personal data still present in there, but it's a transient operation as far as the machine translation engine is concerned. Nothing is ever stored on the machine translation engine from the content that passes through. So there is no data storage and no data processing apart from the machine translation process itself.
Great stuff, thank you, Ray. Okay, well, as I say, we've had certainly a few questions come in, but I think as we have no more, I can wrap up and close the webinar and just say to everyone, thank you very much for attending. It's quite a lot of useful information there about GDPR and SDL WorldServer, so we really hope you found today's session useful, and we'll make sure the recording is definitely available to everyone once we're ready to issue that, as well as the ebook itself as well that Ray mentioned earlier. And if you have any questions about GDPR and WorldServer, please do reach out to him on his details as he shared earlier. So thank you very much again. We look forward to seeing you on one of our future webinars, and just have a good day from me, and thank you very much.
Thank you all.